88.7 The River now presents Barometer, a weekly show offering insight and information that affects North Wellington and Southern Grey counties. The opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of Saugeen Community Radio Inc. or 88.7 The River.
Welcome to this edition of Barometer. I'm your host this week, Heather Guerin, and on the show today we have Tarrah Young from Green Being Farms. She's out in Ayton, and she does organic farming. Mm-hmm. Hi, Tarrah.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Now, Tarrah, you are the farmer in your family.
Correct.
That's awesome. How did you get into farming?
I was not born into farming the way many people are. I am from Kitchener originally. I went to the University of Guelph. I was pursuing a degree in environmental biology with the intention of saving the world.
Awesome.
And I hadn't quite figured out how exactly I was going to save the world. On a whim, I took a course in organic agriculture. Although looking back, I don't know what made me do that. But so I'm in this organic agriculture class, and the professor, who was a woman, was bringing in really inspiring people, farmers who were women, farmers who were not necessarily from farm backgrounds. And one day I truly had I had an epiphany, and I realized I want to be a farmer. It spoke to me as a way that I could actually enact some of my beliefs about how I want to treat the planet. It's challenging. It's outdoor work. It's hard. I realized I like working hard.
That's awesome.
And our whole lives, I think, when if you're not from a farm, you're presented with all these career options, but being a farmer is never one of them.
No, because generally you're born into being a farmer.
Yeah, and there are fewer and fewer farmers every day.
As farming becomes more of a business and properties are bigger and fewer people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And not every kid that grows up on a farm wants to follow in their parents' footsteps.
Yep.
That's right. But there are lots of people that I think if you make that option available, there's so many really enticing things about agriculture as a career. And I just realized all those things spoke to me. And from that day forward, I knew I was going to be a farmer.
How do you find being a woman and being a farmer?
There are definitely some challenges. In lots of ways, there's no difference. Running a business, whether you're male or female, I don't think it always matters. There are some stigmas that need to be overcome. I think when I moved into our community, when people would come to the farm to speak with us, input suppliers or anybody really, they would instinctively speak to my husband.
Mm-hmm. But he's not the farmer.
He's not. I mean, he works on the farm, definitely, but it's I'm the main farmer. Yeah. And after a while of, me always answering the questions, even though they weren't directed at me, slowly people got on board. Oh, she knows something. So that's hard. I struggle physically because everything is made for a man.
And you're fairly petite.
Yeah.
How tall are you?
5'2".
And you're very small. Okay.
Yeah. 5'2", just over 100 pounds, and even finding gloves that fit me. Trying to go into a store that sells work clothes for women, one of the hardest things. Mm-hmm. And then, just hand tools that are made for larger people. Everything, even tractors, trying to reach the pedal. So that can be hard. Just lifting bales, hauling sacks of feed, that kind of stuff. They're heavy. Yeah. Yep. That said, there are some things that having small hands that can be easier. Delivering animals, I'm always the one who, if an animal has to be extracted, I'm the girl for you.
That's awesome. Yeah. All right. So you chose to settle in Ayton. Mm-hmm. Why Ayton?
Practically speaking, we had to find land that we could afford. And so anywhere north of Mount Forest was an option for us.
And you moved here how many years ago?
10 years.
10 years, and you've been farming for 15. Okay. Now, tell me about Green Being. Why did you come up with that name?
Yeah.
How did you come up with that name?
It took a long time. I wanted a name that, implied what we were all about. And the green in Green Being, kind of conveys that there's an ecological bent to what we do. But the being really speaks to how we raise our animals. So one of the really important things for me is that we raise our animals in a way that lets them be the creatures they're meant to be. So a chicken gets to scratch and roost, and a pig gets to root and wallow. And so that be and being speaks to that.
All right. So before you owned your own farm, you moved around from farm to farm to farm. Can you tell me about that process?
Sure. So right after graduating, I started an internship on an organic farm, and I ended up spending 4 years there and learning all about, I learned so much in those 4 years. More than I ever did in my university career.
It's funny that way, isn't it?
And learning by doing is
the best way to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And by the end, I was managing a fairly sizable organic farm.
Where was it?
That was in Hillsburg.
Where's that?
Outside of Guelph, near the town of Erin.
Okay.
And after that, I moved to the Yukon to a 200-acre grass-fed beef and vegetable farm, and had quite the experience farming in the Yukon, as you can imagine.
Yes, I can. You were telling me about the soil there.
Yeah, very unbelievably poor soil. Very short growing season.
How short?
Pretty much, timing is everything. If you have to get your crops in on the first warm day and get them out, there's no room for error at all.
Or vacation, I'm assuming.
Or vacation. It's, if you're a workaholic, you're in trouble in the Yukon, because farmers tend to work from sunrise to sunset.
Oh.
When the sun doesn't set.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are days where it's almost 24 hours of sunlight there.
Yeah. Wow. It's absolutely, you could farm at 3 a.m. if that's what you wanted to do. Yes. But it's good. It teaches you that there has to be more than just the sun to rule your life.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did they go about farming, and what did you farm with poor soil?
So we did do vegetables.
What kind of vegetables? Obviously not corn.
Obviously not corn.
Okay.
Potatoes.
Okay.
Greens did very well.
Okay.
Greens did very well. Root vegetables, carrots, that kind of thing would do okay. But the farm, when I got there, it was a recently purchased farm, and they were still struggling a lot with finding inputs that were suitable for organics and that would help get the soil back. Okay. So it was a tricky time on that farm. The other tricky thing was, one thing I learned was the bacteria inherent in northern soil are not the same as down here, and makes it really difficult to grow legumes. And so for the livestock grazing, they didn't have the same protein options that you would further south.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you moved back from the Yukon, and is that when you decided to purchase?
I had a short stint on a farm in Pennsylvania. And this farm, to me, it was a huge turning point. I'd seen a lot of farms struggle in my, career about learning about farms. And I went to this, I worked on this farm just for a couple months that really ran it as a business and knew all their numbers, knew how long it took them to do every task, clocked everything, and did well financially. And it was just it was just a great place to work. And it was there that I realized, I am ready to start my own business. Because that's another aspect of farming. It's fun to work outside. It's fun to work hard, all of that. But running a business is a whole other part of the picture. And not everybody's cut out to be an entrepreneur.
No, they're not. You have to have a lot of self-discipline.
Yeah. And I realized at that point I really wanted to do that. I'd picked up enough over the, in those last 5 years that I was ready to put it all together and enact my own vision.
So what was the starting process of your farm?
We began Green Being Farm on rented land just north of Guelph, working with an organization called Farm Start that helps aspiring farmers get started. And so we kind of incubated our business on rented land through them, got a customer base while working full-time. My husband was working full-time. I was working full-time in Mississauga.
That must have been an awful commute.
Awful commute. Got worse when we moved up here.
Oh.
But we just raised some turkeys, some chickens, and a few pigs. But it was enough to kind of get the customer base started, start some systems, just keep farming while we saved up money to put a down payment on a farm.
How was it to have your first animals? Like, that must have been a really big challenge. It's considering you lived in a city for most of your life.
Yes. Because when I got into farming, it was mostly vegetables. And then in the Yukon, it kind of transitioned over. Then I realized I really like animals. And then in Pennsylvania, it was all livestock. It was all pigs and chickens and cattle. And they're a bit more interesting than vegetables. Pigs just have more personality than a carrot. But when your carrots get sick, it's not as hard as when your pigs get sick. Our pigs never got sick, but at the end of the day, they do have to leave you.
Yes.
And incredibly difficult to part with our first animals.
So you called it animal husbandry, like you're married to your animals?
Yeah. And, that term husbandry really, there is a commitment that you make that you're going to be there for them day or night and do everything you can to give them the best life possible.
You just had a litter of pigs born.
Yes.
And our interview was postponed for a day because you had an injury. So what happened?
Well, I checked on my sow at 2 a.m. that morning. She was not due for another 2 days. She was fast asleep and snoring when I checked on her. So 5 hours later in the morning, we go in. My husband Nathan checked on her. Said, "Yep, there's 4 piglets." It's like, oh, okay, well that's not a huge litter.
Nope.
I went to check on her and I found a 5th, and the 5th was had probably been suffocating, stuck underneath Mom in a pile of straw, which is really normal in pigs.
Very normal. And that's usually why people have them crated off, right?
Yeah.
From their piglets. Do you do that?
No, I find that choosing the right sows and providing enough loose bedding with some kind of call them roll bars, some bars in the area where if she flops against the wall, the piglet can scoot underneath.
Okay.
We're okay. And my good sows, we don't usually lose any. So it kind of made me wonder what was going on. The pig wasn't entirely dead, so that's just tricky when they're 80% dead.
Yeah.
And I was able to warm it up over the course of the day and get some colostrum in it. But I think that what happened with this particular pig is when it was born, it maybe suffered some brain damage. Sometimes a long birth can do that because this piglet never regained the use of its limbs and never developed a sucking ability. And it's just, it doesn't matter how many animals I raise. When I see an animal that, it's my job to give them the best life possible, I'm not going to throw in the towel until I've done everything I can.
Which is totally reasonable. But that must have been hard.
It was hard. Often we have great turnarounds. When an animal wants to live, everything wants to live.
Yes.
Maybe not turkeys, but everything else wants to live.
Do you still have turkeys?
Turkeys for me are, I don't know. Maybe some people have stories they can tell about that boyfriend they just keep going back to, and then they break up with them, and then they go back. It's like me with turkeys. I'll raise them, and I'll say, okay, never again. And then a few years later, we think, okay, let's raise turkeys.
Yeah.
Never again. They're people call them curious. They're just curious about all the creative ways they can
kill themselves.
To die. Exactly.
That's awesome. All right. So we've gone over why you started farming, where you went to school, and a little bit about your animal husbandry, but let's go back to crops. You are not certified organic.
Correct.
Okay. Why did you choose that route?
The farms I worked on were certified organic, but we did a lot of wholesaling. Mm-hmm. When I started my own farm, I knew I could never get to the size where I could justify wholesaling.
Okay.
If I was going to make a living on the small number of acres we could afford, it would all have to be direct to customers, so we could capture the full retail dollar.
Yeah.
When you are selling directly to a customer, the need for a certification is not there when you can provide your customers an opportunity to see what you're doing firsthand and ask all the questions that they might have.
And actually show up on the farm.
They come to we have open houses. If any new customer wants just to see the farm before buying something, 100% they can come check it out. And so I'll get grilled by potential customers on our practices, and I think that's great. Being able to have a connection between an eater and a farmer, I think, is something that we're losing.
Yes, absolutely.
And people need to know how their food is raised.
I really like the stickers. If you've eaten today, thank a farmer. And we don't really do that anymore, which is a huge shame. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think we'll cut to a break right now, and we'll be back at 88.7 The River. Welcome back. I'm Heather Guerin, and this week on Barometer, I'm speaking with Tarrah Young from Green Being. She is a organic farmer out in Ayton. All right, Tarrah. So what do you have on your farm?
We are a very diversified operation. We produce vegetables for about 100 families in the area. And they are distributed from between the months of November and March. So winter crops, mostly storage crops, but we also have some greenhouses, and we do greens all winter long.
Awesome.
On top of that, we do grass-fed beef, grass-fed lamb, pastured pork, and chicken, and sometimes eggs.
And sometimes turkeys.
And sometimes turkeys.
All right. Why is it important to pasture all your animals?
That kind of goes back to our mandate to let animals be the creatures they're meant to be. So most animals want to be outside. Mm-hmm. And I feel that they are much healthier when they have access to grass and space and fresh air. So there's a humane aspect to it. Mm-hmm. Our pigs have, huge area of kind of bush where they can crash around in the bush and root and wallow in the mud, and they just have a great life. So I think that's great for the pigs. I think it also makes better quality meat. Happy animals make delicious animals? I think so, yeah. That's cool. I mean, our meat is divine. Same with the poultry. Anybody who's ever had a pastured chicken has a very hard time going back. Yep. It's just
Same
so
with
much
the
better.
Eggs too.
Yeah.
They have this beautiful yellow orange quality to the yolk that just is lacking in store-bought products.
And the nutritional profile of an egg like that is much, much better.
So why is it important to grass feed your beef? You were telling me about omega-3s?
Yeah. So with beef and lamb, now those animals are ruminants, which means that their stomachs were designed to digest grass.
Yes.
And that's pretty much it.
Yes.
And so it's much better for the animal to be eating what it's meant to eat. I think that makes for a healthier animal. Mm-hmm. It also makes for healthier meat. So when an animal eats something green, it produces omega-3 fatty acids, which are stored in the fat. And omega-3 fatty acids have 1 million different health benefits for humans. On top of that, there is a compound called conjugated linoleic acid that is only found in the fat of a grass-fed animal, or that would also mean in the cream or the butter from grass-fed cows.
Delicious.
Yes. And it has been strongly tied to cancer prevention and even fighting. And it's a very rare compound in our diets now because practically all of the meat that we're eating is being fed grain. And the more grain an animal eats, the fewer omega-3 fatty acids there are in the fat. So it just means that our meat has the potential to be a really healthy food to feed your family.
I'd also like to mention that omega-3 fatty acids are really good for your joints, and anybody who's suffering from arthritis should really start putting in more omega-3 fatty acids.
Absolutely. Anything, it's very anti-inflammatory.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's great in that regard. Now we're all taking oil supplements.
Pills?
Yeah. To try to get those omega-3s into our body. But historically we were getting them because our animals were all, even our pigs, they're eating tons of grass. It's sad if you look at the fish industry now, they're being farmed.
Yes.
They're not eating green stuff. And you can see that the color of the fish and the omega-3 fatty acid profiles of fish is going down now.
I always found it strange that farmed fish would have higher mercury contents as well. By the way, women should only eat fish once a week because of the mercury content in fish. So the more fish you eat, the worse it is mercury-wise.
It's scary because fish used to be considered such a healthy food and so important for so many people.
Absolutely, and you should be eating it 3 times a week, but no, once a week for women, especially women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, once a week, and that's including like a can of tuna, and that's it. All right, so what are the general practices of organic farming, or what are the principles of organic farming?
One of the main principles is the simple rule to mimic nature. And so, in a lot of ways, organic farming is kind of easy because you just have to look at what would happen in nature and see how you can apply that on your farm. So, for example, there's a lot of diversity in nature. When you walk into the forest and you look up and you see birds and squirrels and bugs, and you look across and you see all the underbrush, and if you were to look into the soil, the amount of soil life in a forest it's just teeming with life. Yeah. So, nature never, adopts monoculture practices.
No.
And so, on a good organic farm, you should see lots of diversity.
Biodiversity.
Yes.
Okay. All right. We'll get into that soon.
Yeah. The other way, with livestock, when we're mimicking nature, herding animals tend to migrate.
Yes.
And they're doing that for lots of reasons. One is to move to new food sources. Another is to move away from their parasites. In agriculture, we tend to be kind of static with our livestock and keep them in one spot for longer than is beneficial for them. So what we do is we have a very intensive rotation with our livestock, so they're always being moved to new grass.
So you have 20 head of cattle, and how small of a space are they in before you move them?
We would give ours about an acre at a time.
Okay. But how long do they take to?
About 2 days.
Okay.
Yeah. Now you could even have them in a far greater concentration, and that would even more closely mimic nature.
Yes.
Because animals, that's not inhumane at all. And, herding animals feel safe.
In large numbers.
Yeah.
Protection in the herd.
Exactly. When you see a field and there's, cattle dotted here and there, sheep just, randomly located around the farm, it's probably because there's not enough good food in that pasture and they have to spread out to try to find enough to eat.
Do you have any problems with coyotes?
We do not, but we take a lot of preventive measures.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I find is really important if you're trying to not lose your animals to coyotes rather than just hunting them. The best way to do it is to go out and be proactive about it.
Yeah. And that actually goes back to another kind of principle of organic farming, which is, my professor at Guelph described it as problem avoidance by design. That's her definition of organic agriculture, because once you have a problem in organics, you can't fix it with a spray. So it's all about prevention. It's all about how do I design a system that doesn't succumb to disease, So with the coyotes, well, we have livestock guardian dogs, and we have a very good 6-strand electric fence. So we've taken steps to prevent the problem before it happens.
Okay. So small area, keeping your herds tight together is a really good thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then moving them every 2 days?
Yeah. So I'll use our sheep as an example. We have about 60 sheep, and every 3 days they move to a new piece of grass. And the reason why it's 3 days is for parasite control. So when sheep are actually, if we're thinking about what happens in nature, they are by nature browsers. Mm-hmm. They're mountain animals, and they don't want to eat off the ground. They want to eat off of shrubs. And so when they're in a pastoral system, they're at the risk of picking up parasites. And this is why conventionally shepherds are having to deworm their sheep multiple times a year. Mm-hmm. We're going on 10 years and we've never dewormed our sheep once.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. And a big part of that is that, it takes 3 days for a worm egg that is in the manure of a sheep to hatch, mm-hmm. and for that new little worm to crawl up in a blade of grass and be re-ingested. So if we move our sheep to a new paddock every 3 days, they're moving away from those parasites. And we don't bring them back until until we feel confident that,
that worm is dead.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what we'll do is we'll even, the next animal to come through and graze that area will be cattle. Mm-hmm. And in that system, cattle are a dead-end host for sheep parasites. They kind of vacuum out the parasites. They're not in any way affected by them. And then when the sheep come in again, the grass is clean.
That's very cool.
So those kinds of strategies, they're kind of system designs mm-hmm. that prevent us from having to rely on dewormers. Yeah.
So there are some things that are banned in organic farming. Is deworming one of them?
I think, yes. Yeah. I think there's some concessions made for your breeding animals. Okay. And that's another reason why we're not certified. I actually think that our standards are maybe even a bit stricter than mm-hmm. in organics with our animals. Our animals are always outside, always on grass. That's not necessarily the case with organics. But I just lost my train of thought there.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. All right. So we're going through the general principles of organic farming. So one of them is holistic farming. So having your animals outside all the time. Mm-hmm. No fertilizers.
Right. So you were asking about banned substances.
Yes.
Yeah. Pretty much, I think the kind of blanket rule is if it can be produced in nature, it's something that you might be able to use in organics.
Okay.
And so the vast majority of chemical pesticides, whether they're fungicides, herbicides, or an actual pesticide, and chemical fertilizers are not options for organic farmers.
We were talking earlier, and you mentioned fungi and how they're really important in organic farming.
Yeah, fungi are hugely important. Bacteria are hugely important. And this kind of goes back to maybe the third big principle in organic agriculture, mm-hmm. which is to feed the soil. What we know is that the millions of critters in the soil mm-hmm. are absolutely critical for the health of our plants.
Yes.
And there are incredibly complex relationships that our plants form with the fungi and with the bacteria that help them grow. And the plant knows what it needs, so if we're growing our plants in semi-sterile soil, we're not playing with a full deck, and our plants can be more vulnerable. When we're feeding the soil, what we're doing is we're fostering the growth of these fungi, the bacteria, and they in turn feed the plant. And so we have this little mantra that healthy soil makes healthy plants, which make healthy people.
So kind of like animal husbandry. Happy animals, happy meat, good meat, happy people.
Yeah, and in this case too, the animals are in the soil. So we're feeding the millions of microbes and fungi that are there to provide nutrients for the plant, rather than just a chemical fertilizer that feeds the plant directly.
Okay, so there was one thing that I read, and it said that you had to be very careful about putting animal gut bacteria on growing things, and that there has to be a certain way of doing it. Like you could get E. coli from bean sprouts. So can you tell me a bit about how you go about composting manure before you spread it?
Mm-hmm. There are rules depending on what kind of crop you're growing.
Okay.
So it can be raw manure if it's a field crop, like a grain. If it's vegetables, if you're not going to be harvesting them for a certain number of days, I think it's 120, it could be raw manure. But if you're going to be growing something like lettuce, then yeah, it has to be fully composted and composted according to a very strict set of standards.
What are the standards for that?
That would be something that an organic advisor would probably be better equipped.
Okay.
All of our crops take a full 90 to 120 days to come to maturity. So although we compost all of our sheep manure, it doesn't have to necessarily be strictly classified as compost, because of the length of time that they're in the field. Yeah. But the fact that we use compost is a nod to sort of the health of the soil. Compost, it does provide nutrients for a plant, but more than that, it feeds the bacteria and fungi. A lot of the nutrients in compost aren't actually made available to the plant for many years. Rather, we're adding organic matter to the soil. And that, as it slowly breaks down, provides a slow release of nutrients, making it a less of a risky input than, say, raw manure that can run off and enter water sources.
I heard something very interesting recently, that fungi or mushrooms, just the tip of the mushroom, like what you eat, is mainly just the reproductive organ of the mushroom, and that mushrooms spread under the ground for thousands of kilometers. Like they are the largest species on the planet, and one of like the biggest organisms ever.
Oh, they're fascinating.
So cool.
Yeah.
So cool.
There's a group called mycorrhizal fungi, and they set up a very intimate relationship with plant roots, where they'll actually infect, quote unquote, the root. The plant wants it to grow inside the root, and the plant will then, in return, receive nutrients, water from the mycorrhizal fungi, because although a root can only travel so far, mycorrhizal fungi can travel hundreds of meters through the soil. So you picture a drought year where there's no water in the top couple feet of soil. How are these plants going to get water? Through their mycorrhizal relationships. And so those mycorrhizal fungi can go deep down, bring water to the plant, and help it stay healthy. And they found that in soils that had the proper amounts of mycorrhizal fungi, the protein content of the foods was 300% compared to soil that was devoid.
Conventionally farmed?
Yeah. And the reason why conventionally farmed soils tend to lack mycorrhizal fungi is that chemical fertilizers are really toxic to a lot of soil life. One application of a chemical fertilizer will knock out about 70% of your soil bacteria and fungi. So when scientists have studied the number of say bacteria in an organic soil versus a conventional one, you're looking at 25,000 different species in an organic soil, maybe 100 to 1,000 in a conventional. So, that's 250 times more species in the organic soil. So, imagine you ran a company with 250 employees. And only one showed up to work one day.
Oh, you'd be screwed.
You'd be screwed.
Yeah.
So, that's how an organic soil can function without the crutches of pesticides, because everybody showed up to work.
That's awesome.
And they're all working. Most of those bacteria and fungi are very beneficial and play really important roles in keeping our plants healthy. And our job is to foster their growth instead of inhibit it.
Can you tell me about insects, predator insects that are good for organic farming?
Sure. Now, there are...
So not all insects are bad?
No.
Okay.
No. I remember seeing this crazy... It was a few years ago. Let me see if I can remember. But I had a rutabaga crop, and something was something was awry. There was some bug all over it, and there were so many bugs. I mean, I don't know what all the bugs are. There
are a lot of bugs.
There are a lot of bugs. But anyway, something was attacking my rutabagas, and I decided to just sit back and watch. And because there was something else on my leaves, and I didn't know what it was. It was actually ladybug larvae when I looked it up later. But I sat back, and instead of seeing my crop be decimated, the ladybug larvae fought back and actually restored the balance, and I didn't have to do anything.
That's awesome.
So it's kind of like animals. Sometimes you just got to stay back and
let them do their thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I hate to do this, but we have to go for a break, and we will be back on 88.7 The River. Welcome back to this episode of Barometer. I'm Heather Guerin. I'm your host this week, and I'm talking to Tarrah Young from Green Being Farms. She runs an organic farm out of Ayton, Ontario. All right, so I want to talk about weed management because in conventional farming, really, they tend to rely on Roundup. So how do you deal with weeds?
Well,
tricky question.
Yes, weeds are never any fun. In the conventional systems that would use Roundup, like cash cropping systems, I think that organic farmers have a few different options available to them. You know, judicious usage of tillage would be one. But
that's a whole nother subject, right? Tillage?
Tillage is a really controversial topic, and I think that's why I use the word judicious. It has a place in farming, and it's important not to overdo it. Because, yeah, it can lead to soil erosion. It can burn up organic matter. And there are advances in organic cash cropping systems as well as vegetables to go towards a more no-till system where you just use other approaches to minimize how often you're on your tractor working the soil. Again, it's about prevention. The viability of certain weed seeds is decades. You know, if you let your weeds go to seed, you could be looking at 20 years of weeding. 20 years? Yeah. Oh, there's I think it's Are
you talking about like dandelions? Because that stuff is in my lawn and I can't get rid of it.
And every single plant, the number of weed seeds they can create.
It's incredible.
Yeah, they're very, very successful plants.
I don't know how much grass I have. I think it's mostly weeds.
Do you know what though? Dandelions are such a maligned plant.
They're pretty. They're green.
They have as much protein as alfalfa.
Do they really?
Yeah. And when my sheep go out to pasture, the first thing they'll eat are the dandelions.
That's awesome.
And it's interesting because they tend to be out there in full force in the spring. Mm-hmm. That's when my sheep are lactating. And historically, it was believed that dandelions help with milk production. Mm-hmm. And so here I have my lactating sheep out there systematically taking out every dandelion.
That's awesome.
Because it's the one plant out there with the most protein, and apparently it can help with milk.
Also, if you drink dandelion tea every morning, warm or cold, I prefer it cold, but it is really beneficial for your liver. It's really good.
Right.
Okay.
Just like dandelion greens.
Yeah.
Any bitter green is good for your liver.
Absolutely. Okay.
So, there's the point that not all weeds are evil.
Okay.
But in our vegetable systems, so I should just say in our pasture systems, we have very few weeds because of how we graze. Weeds just don't go to seed the way that
you move everybody so quickly through it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I see overgrazed fields just plagued with thistle.
Yes.
You don't see that on our farm. We don't have thistle.
Really?
We have just thick, tall, lush grass.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that's just because of how we graze. With the vegetables, we just do everything possible not to let weeds go to seed. When our fields are bare, we put a cover crop in.
Okay.
And that occupies the soil, it feeds the soil, and it prevents weeds from getting a toehold.
You mean like legumes?
Like legumes, for sure, because they also add nitrogen.
Yes.
Certain crops like rye is so vigorous, it'll smother other weeds out.
Okay. And winter wheat.
Winter wheat is another really good one. Yeah. In our smaller vegetable crops, we'll mulch.
Okay.
And so adding straw around, say, our garlic is great because then we don't have to weed it. And as that decomposes, it adds lots of organic matter to the soil.
Awesome.
And organic matter, I should just say, I haven't really talked about why that's so important.
Okay.
But organic matter is it's basically a measure of how much carbon's in your soil. And just 1 pound of organic matter can hold 20 pounds of water. So with drought, with droughts being more and more prevalent, the more organic matter you can have in your soil, the more drought resistant your soil will be.
Okay. And the more likely that fungi will grow, habitate, spread deep,
Completely.
And then bring up water.
Yeah, that's their habitat, is in the organic
Cool.
matter.
Okay.
And as organic matter decomposes, it will provide about 20 pounds a year. For every percentage of organic matter you have, 20 pounds of nitrogen.
Wow.
And so we can get nitrogen from so many places, not just fertilizers. Healthy organic soil will be teeming with earthworms. We should get about 20 earthworms per shovelful. You can get, just from the dead earthworms in your soil alone, about 100 pounds of nitrogen. That's almost enough to grow a crop of corn.
Wow.
So it's just about fostering this really vibrant ecosystem in your soil. It's really the key to being able to grow organically.
Okay. So we were talking about weeds and how you occupy the soil so that you don't get the opportunity to grow weeds. Can we talk about carbon sinking and rotating your animals? All right. So in the 90s, there were 40,000 elephants that were killed in Africa. And the reason they were killed was a scientist thought that they were causing desertification. All right. So when they killed the 40,000 elephants, desertification got worse. Why did it get worse?
What is actually going on is that herds of migrating animals are critical for the survival of grasslands. And that grasslands and migrating, herding animals actually evolved together.
Yes.
The rumens of these animals, evolved basically with grass.
Because grass hasn't been around forever. No, it is very new since the Ice Age.
And it needs the action of these migrating animals to regenerate it.
Yes.
And so you picture a herd of antelope, bison, elephants, anything, moving through a landscape. They're usually going pretty fast, and they're eating indiscriminately. Yes. Anything, including weeds. And so they're taking bites, whatever. They're not being selective because they're on the move, and their hoof action is anything that they're not eating is being ground into the earth. And any urine that's coming out is watering. So now you've got, in a really, we call it a brittle environment. Especially in, sub-Saharan Africa, that kind of, brittle environment's very dry. And so plants don't, here, they all decompose in the winter. The snow comes, pushes them into contact with the soil where microbes break them down. There, things tend to just turn to dust and blow away. But when they're trampled, now they are, put into contact with the soil where they can become organic matter. And so what, scientists found was that the impact of all of this hoof action, this manuring, this urination, life flourished in the wake of these migrating animals.
Yes.
And so rather than cordoning off these big preserves, keeping animals out, we have to let them in.
Yes.
And they will actually regenerate the soil. And so there in Zimbabwe, they set up some studies doing this with livestock. Goats.
Yeah.
And having them mimic that herding, that migratory action. And the results that I've seen, the photos are unbelievable.
Yep.
Desertification, which is a massive contributor to climate change, being reversed. Plants are growing, providing food, not only for the animals, but then income for the ranchers. And soil is coming back instead of being blown away.
Which we're having a really big problem with.
Really, we cannot address climate change unless we address desertification. And I don't think here in Grey County we think about it too much.
No.
Because we don't have that kind of environment. But what we do have here are great opportunities for doing the same thing because we have migrating type animals. We have cattle, goats, sheep, and we have grass that, grass grows really, really well here.
It does.
And grass has a lot of potential for taking carbon out of the air where we have too much of it in the form of carbon dioxide, and using it and sequestering it in the soil where it does a lot of good.
And that's called
that's a carbon sink.
Awesome.
So the soil is a huge carbon sink. After the oceans, it's the biggest carbon sink we have. And so scientists are realizing, hey, we can use animals to help manage our grasslands, produce really good food, and keep our grasslands productive so that they are sequestering as much carbon as possible. I've seen some amazing, jaw-dropping data about how much carbon we could be taking out of the atmosphere if ranchers and farmers started adopting kind of more progressive grazing techniques. It's actually called carbon farming. You can Google carbon farmers of America, and these ranchers and grazers are really trying to figure out the best animals, the best grazing techniques, the best grasses that will take as much carbon out of the air and put it deep into the soil where it will not oxidize. It's just a win-win-win kind of scenario where now you're producing more food. It's healthier because it's animals raised on grass, and it's better for the environment.
We were talking about soil erosion. Now, we do this in farming practices all by ourselves. We till the land. So, tilling the land is not good for fungi, and it can cause, what's the word I'm looking for? Soil to blow away in the wind. All right. So how do you till your farm?
As infrequently as possible. Vegetables are a really tricky one. They're one of the hardest I would say vegetables are harder on the soil than a lot of crops.
They leach nutrients from it?
No, just say you're going to grow a crop of radishes. You have to till the soil before you plant them. And then you control the weeds, usually through tillage. And then they come out of the ground 30 days later. And then perhaps you till again and then plant another crop. Whereas with a field crop, say wheat, the turnover isn't as quick.
Yeah.
So there's always extra challenge with vegetables in terms of reducing tillage. But timing your tillage is a big part of the equation. How deep you till can make a big difference. I think historically we've always tilled or plowed far too deep.
Okay.
You can till very lightly if you time it properly and knock your weeds down when they're hardly even visible to the naked eye.
Okay.
And then you hardly have to even give the soil a back scratch. And so you're having far less of an impact on the soil when you're tilling that lightly.
How would that be done naturally, like chicken scratching and everything going into the soil that way? How did we come across tilling in the first place?
I think the pressure to produce enough food to be economically viable means that we need to keep our weeds under control. I also think we tend to go almost too far. I think sometimes we don't want the neighbors to see a single weed. And so it becomes a bit about optics. Okay. I can look at a field, and if it's weedy, but it's October, I know those weeds are not going to go to seed, and I can let them do their thing rather than eradicate them at all costs. You have to ask the question, what threat is this weed posing at this point in time? Okay. One thing that we do to keep our weeds under control, and therefore reduce tillage, is we rotate our crops. And this is a really big part of organic agriculture, is crop rotation. And one of the reasons why we rotate our crops is because depending on the length of time that your crop is in the ground and what type of crop it is, you'll see different weeds. There's spring weeds, there's fall weeds, there's perennial weeds, there's annual weeds. And so if you always grow the same thing, you're going to always have the same kind of weeds. And so by rotating our crops, so one year it's potatoes, the next year it's squash, the next year it's garlic, we don't actually see a buildup of a
certain type of weed.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that crop rotation does so many other things for our systems. We don't extract too much of any one kind of nutrient, and we don't see the pest buildups and disease buildups that you do when you keep one crop in your rotation for too long.
Tell me about biodiversity. We touched on it earlier, but how do you foster it?
There's biodiversity below ground level. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, the tens of thousands of different bacteria and fungi that are so important for soil life. And we can't even identify all of these critters yet. And yet we do see that plants, I think this is fascinating, but every single plant takes energy from the sun and funnels it down through the roots to make something called exudates. Exudates is essentially bacteria and fungi food.
Okay.
Sugary substances that attract very specific, microbial populations to that particular plant. And they're there to either bring certain nutrients to the plant, fend off certain diseases, provide natural growth hormones. Every single strain of every single crop has a different exudate recipe.
Cool.
And they're very carbon rich. And this is how we're taking carbon out of the air and putting it into the soils through these exudates. And so by growing different crops, different exudate recipes bring different bacteria and fungi populations into the soil. So if you just have a field and all you ever grow is corn or soy, you're never going to have the diversity, the biodiversity that you would in an organic soil.
And that's why you'd have to add fertilizers and pesticides and weed
There's
control.
a lot of doing battle against certain things rather than just preventing those things in the first place. And then above soil level, we grow about 20 different vegetables, types of vegetables. Then there's sheep, chickens, pigs, cattle, and they all play a role. And I get really excited about finding ways that all of these, players on the farm can benefit each other. And so if I'm going to sow a cover crop in one of my vegetable fields to feed the soil, before, sometimes I'll rather than tilling these in, I'll let the animals graze them first. And so the animals are getting some food, and then they're also putting their manure down exactly where it's needed for the next vegetable crop.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. All right. How does, do you think that organic farming is less harmful to the environment in general? Does it produce less carbon emissions? What kinds of negative effects could organic farming have?
So yeah, and the reason why I went into organic agriculture was because I saw that it has the ability to do less harm when done properly, and has the ability to do some really great things. But I do want to also say that there is a spectrum in terms of farmers, and not all organic farmers are great, and certainly not all conventional farmers can't all be lumped in the same either. And I have some amazing conventional neighbors that are also using cover crops. And I think that, in the future it would be great if there was a middle ground where we all met and used strategies and technologies that were a bit more universal. But yeah, one of the studies that I think was done really well was done by the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, because they've been studying doing a side-by-side comparison of more conventional approaches versus organic approaches. It's a 30-year study now, and it's still going on. And as opposed to just tilling up a field and calling it organic and trying to see how it does against, a conventional system, it takes a while for organic systems to really flourish, because those, microbiological populations need to come back into.
Why usually certification takes 3 years before you can be classified as organic?
Yeah, because it's really hard. It's like beating an addiction. It takes some time to get off of drugs, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing with organic systems. So they'll usually suffer for the first few years. And in a really simple study, you might say, oh, organic agriculture cannot feed the world because the yields aren't there. But in this study, it was shown that no, definitely organic yields either match that of conventional yields, or they will surpass that of conventional yields in drought years. And looking to the future, I think we're seeing a lot more of that. Organic systems, they found, sequester more carbon. That builds more organic matter. That makes your soil more resilient, more able to hold on to water in a dry year.
All right, so we're about to wrap it up, but I'd really like you to plug in right now and tell our listeners where they can find you, how they can order from you, how they could get more information.
Certainly. The best thing to do is just go to our website, which is Green Being Farm, not green bean, the vegetable, but beingfarm.ca. So greenbeingfarm.ca. The first thing to do is on the very front page of the website, there's an opportunity to join our newsletter. It's about 4 times a year, and just give you an update on what's going on and give you an invitation to place your orders every year. So you can order our pork, lamb, beef, chicken, and join our vegetable program right from our website.
Thank you very much for coming in. It was wonderful having you here.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Join us next week on Barometer, 7 p.m. on Wednesdays. 88.7 The River.